Our Graduate Center. Welcome to all of you here in the room and to those of you elsewhere watching the live stream. You know who you are. Our speaker tonight is an old friend of mine. Paula and I met in 1993, and it has been a privilege, really, to learn from her over the years. She's currently the Ubaldo Pierotti Professor of Italian History at Stanford University, where she is the chair of the History Department and director of the Supp Center for the History and Philosophy of Science. Before coming to Stanford, she was a professor in the Department of History at UC Davis. Her PhD was from Berkeley in 1989, and her publications, the run of important and influential works, begin with what was her dissertation, Possessing Nature, Museums, Collecting, and Scientific Culture in Early Modern Italy, published in 1994, followed by The Italian Renaissance, 2002, Merchants and Marvels, a wonderful collection edited with Pamela Smith in 2002, Beyond Florence, Athanasius Kircher, The Last Man Who Knew Everything, 2004, The Contest for Knowledge, 2005, Italy's 18th Century, Gender and Culture in the Age of the Grand Tour, 2009, Early Modern Things, Objects and Their Histories, 1500, 1800 in 2013, and as one of the translators into English of Renata Ago's The Taste for Things, A History of Objects in 17th Century Rome, translated in 2013, but some of you with long memories will remember that we heard some of that here many years before. She's also just completed one of the monumental volumes in the series devoted to publishing Castiano del Pozzo's Paper Museum. It's Series B, Natural History, Part V, Fauna, Minerals, and Natural Curiosities. And I think Fauna, Minerals, and Natural Curiosities is the perfect segue into tonight's talk, which asks about crocodiles, what kinds of things they are and where they belong. Paula Finlan.
Thank you so much, Peter, and thanks to all of you for coming out this evening. I now know that Peter has a caiman in his house above his study, so had I known that, I would have come even sooner to give the crocodile talk. Well, for those of you who are graduate students, I will start by saying a little preface to this talk. This is a talk I've been working on for a long time. In many ways, it really started when I was doing my dissertation, and so it's lived with me for much of my academic life, and in a way I've been reluctant to publish it, though I think I'm finally getting to the point that I would like to, because every time I've given this paper, people come up with such interesting ideas about where I might take it next, and I then want to follow the trail. In other words, the crocodile is kind of everywhere and is also, as we'll see, many things as well. But let me kind of start with a reflection on the crocodile that doesn't start in the past that I study, in the early modern period, in the 16th through 18th centuries, but starts a little bit closer to the present, about 100 years ago. At the beginning of the 20th century, the French symbolist, writer, and artist Alfred Jarry, who died at the tender age of 34 in 1907, created a painting which he entitled Crocodile of the Phantasms. And I'm going to skip forward for a second. I realized I've added this in. There is no modern reproduction that's really good of this painting, so at the moment you're going to have to settle for a really bad reproduction. It's apparently in the hands of a private collector in Fresno, as many years ago an art history grad student at Santa Barbara told me, who was working on Jarry, and at some point I have to see if I can track it down. But just to give you a bad sense in black and white of what this looks like in this one bad reproduction that I found. So this is Crocodile of the Phantasms from the beginning of the 20th century. And as you'll see here, in the center of the painting, shadowy visages of skeletons perform an eerie dance in sight of a crocodile that hangs from the ceiling. And so the question, of course, is what is the crocodile doing there? And why, according to Jarry, is it the object of our nocturnal imagination? Now, Jarry's painted crocodile was more than just a casual image for him. Rather, it was the central symbol of his entire conception of art. Around the same time that he was at work on his painting, in an essay entitled Diverse Prizes that appeared in 1903, he offered the following assessment of art in general that might be described as an aphorism, writing quite simply, and I'll go back to my other image of here, the work of art, by definition, is a stuffed crocodile. This was not the starting point for my project, but I think in many ways this coda on the project about the early modern crocodile is quite a telling one. Jary's singular pronouncement on the nature of art did not emerge simply from his own imagination, though it was surely a reflection of his highly iconoclastic view of culture. Instead, we should remind ourselves that he composed this painting and the words that accompany it during the same period in which the Scottish archaeologist David Murray published his Museums, Their History and Their Use, monumental study that, in many ways started the field, I think, academic field of museum studies as a historical subject. This was also the same period in which the German art historian Julius von Schlosser was completing a work that has never been translated into English, so there is an Italian edition. The work in German is called Die Kunst- und Wunderkammer der Spätrenaissance, right? The Kunst and Wonder Cabinets of the Late Renaissance, appeared in 1908. In other words, the beginning of the 20th century was an important moment in the emergence of a new historical consciousness about the idea of the museum and the objects it contained, especially in its earliest incarnation as a cabinet of curiosities. I would like to think that Jary was one of the many people who became fascinated by the few remaining examples, physical specimens, right, of late medieval and Renaissance crocodiles that could still be found hanging in his day, as in ours, in the apse of various medieval churches in places like southern France, Spain, Italy, Portugal, even Czechoslovakia. I haven't found any surviving specimens in Germany that are in churches, but this awaits further study, perhaps. A few of them in town halls, and others, of course, gathering dust in the remnants of old museums. The stuffed crocodile was indeed a striking artifact. And here I want to kind of just move forward to give you a couple of photos of examples of these surviving ones. You can go online. In fact, I want to mention there's a student who's finishing at Yale right now who has very nicely begun to do an inventory that he's going to publish in a paper I just had the pleasure of reading. This is a undergrad, believe it or not, named Spencer Weinreich, who is doing this wonderful study. And he's begun to compile, so far as found, I think 28 of the 29 he compiles are in churches or sanctuaries in the countries that I mentioned, and many of them have been photographed and nowadays are up on Pinterest or various sites of that kind, local sites, so you can actually look around for them as well and see them. The crocodile evokes an era in which paintings had not been the preferred artifact to collect, but existed instead in relationship to a lively traffic among collectors in natural objects such as the crocodile. It was a reminder of the transitory value of all things, because at the dawn of the 20th century, there was nothing more obsolete and more curious and more forgotten than those crocodiles, which were not in modern natural history museums, but where they would be prized for their scientific interest, but instead kept in religious institutions and in old cabinets, public and private, where no one looked at them anymore. We must surely understand Jary's fascination with the crocodile as a historically informed observation about the changing status of different objects that fascinated connoisseurs across the century. In the 16th and 17th centuries, as he rightfully observed, the work of art was a stuffed crocodile. Historians and art historians have long known the importance of the crocodile to the early modern cabinet of curiosities, but we haven't really examined how and why the crocodile became significant in this context, and this is very much the subject of my talk today. Understand the meaning of the crocodile and its apotheosis in a work of art like Jary's Crocodile of the Phantasms offers us an interesting opportunity to explore the intersections among science, art, and nature that shaped the early modern cabinet. If the work of art had become a stuffed crocodile by the early 20th century, the crocodile in its Renaissance incarnation was decisively a work of art. And here let me give you an iconic beginning for this story. The very origins of depicting museums began with the image of the crocodile. And here we see this 1599 engraving of the cabinet of the apothecary Ferrante Imperato in Naples. where he made the crocodile the most important object in his theater of nature. In this well-known image of a cabinet of curiosities, the crocodile is, without a doubt, the largest object in the room. Fixed to the ceiling, it glares ominously at the visitors below. Of all the parts of nature represented in this image, it's the only one to suggest that naturalists may collect nature without ever fully being in possession of it. For the anonymous engraver who created this image, the crocodile was the very essence of Imperato's museum. It fulfilled the fantasy of a museum in which objects and visitors existed in a precarious relationship, observing each other across the empty space of the museum. In other words, this is the only object that really looks back at you in some sense. What is all the more striking is about the importance of the crocodile in the iconography of Imperato's museum is its absence in the description of natural objects in the book that accompanied it, his Natural History. The crocodile appears nowhere in the text of this book that accompanies the engraving. And in some sense, I think the act of rendering an image of the Cabinet of Curiosities gave the crocodile a significance that it did not have in Imperato's own research project to describe and interpret the natural world. The importance of the crocodile to the iconography of the Cabinet of Curiosities continued well into the 17th century, but not much beyond it, as I'll talk about by the end of this discussion. And here, again, just to give you some sense of the ways in which recreations of early modern cabinets seek to replicate this. This is one of, a number of the examples we can find, right, of, these cabinets that, again, recreate the sort of specimens that are put on the ceiling, or as we saw in the case of the church in Orán on the wall, which is the less common but equally acceptable place to put the crocodile. There is a kind of protocol, in other words, an understanding of where to put these objects that's quite meaningful. So after Imperato's 1599 image of the crocodile on the ceiling, subsequent illustrations of early modern collections elaborated further on the theme of the crocodile as the animal that controlled the museum. So if we turn here now to the 1666 catalog of Manfredo Setalla's museum in Milan, what do we see now? What are the crocodiles doing up here? In a way, we can see the afterlife of Imperato's Renaissance crocodile now in a Baroque gallery in a rather differently organized space. Now, if we look closer at this, we will see that there are, it's a little hard to see in the very crowded engraving, but if we look closer, I'm sure with some work I can do an even better close-up now in the age of digital photography, and I will eventually, but I think this will give you a bit more of the idea. You'll see there are no less than 3 crocodiles visible front and center in the museum, and then there are potentially others hidden behind the dolphin and other large marine animals that also populate the ceiling. The most visible crocodile placed in the exact center of the picture and accentuating its perspectival point with its tail seems to be in control of the entire museum. Gripping in its powerful jaw the cord to the curtain that's been pulled back to display Setalla's gallery, this particular curiosity, in some sense, is our tour guide. And let me just kind of go back for a second, right? You can see the curtain's a little clearer here, right? So this is what he's pulling. With one gesture, the crocodile can either open the spectacle or bring it to a close. While Setalla's crocodiles lack the malevolent power of Imperato's singular specimen, they are nonetheless given an equally central role in the iconography of this 17th century gallery. As these 2 examples suggest, the crocodile was more than simply one of many objects in the crowded cabinet of curiosities. To some degree, we should think of it as a corollary to another famously iconic image of an animal, right? Albrecht Dürer's rhinoceros of 1515. An object that circulated in numerous printed versions as a portrait of nature that captured the imagination of early modern Europeans in an age in which they saw themselves as conquering nature, right? As many of you know, this is one of the infinitely reproducible images of this period. It migrates to many, many places. And so in a way does the crocodile, because, well, this is a far more obscure image. I'd like to juxtapose my cabinet crocodiles to this German broadsheet. which is, I think, translated originally either from the Latin or Italian, and it's a story, again, of a crocodile now, found, in the East. It's tied to the, travels to Turkey. It's tied to sort of story of Babylon and the age of the Reformation, In its own way, not the specific image, but the animal that it represents also travels, and multiplies in this era. And what it also raises is this question generally about large animals, and what people do, with their dead remains, right? One early modern visitor to one of the most important collections in this period that I've studied for many years, the Aldrovandi Museum in Bologna, went to the collection in the 18th century. And while he was inside this cabinet, this famous cabinet of natural history, he thought not of the crocodile, but of the rhinoceros. And he thought then of the elephant, which was not there. And he wrote, contemplating what he saw, Thomas Broderick wrote, he observed that a collector would need a city rather than a few rooms to house an entire whale or a rhinoceros, right? So what was too large to go inside the cabinet? So such a remark underscores the impossibility of certain aspects of this world of fauna that could be collected, at least in this kind of entirety, right? Certain parts of nature, right? The crocodile is on the outer edge of what is possible to possess as a whole, right? To fully possess, in other words. For the early modern collector and the audience they strove to engage, the crocodile was the dinosaur, right? Or the whale of the Natural History Museum. The crocodile offered a marked contrast to the fate of many other animals in the cabinet of curiosities. Insects and small birds might survive for a time as complete specimens, though they were known to be precariously fragile. But large animals generally, right, as a rule, entered cabinets in pieces. One might possess the horn of a narwhal, an elephant's tooth, a boar's head, a bear's paws, a whale's skeleton or some part thereof, right? And these are some of the things that actually Broderick enumerates as he's visiting the Aldrovandi collection in Bologna. A lion's head here, its tail and spine there, a portrait of it, right? In a way, the way people collected animals fundamentally reaffirmed something that Aristotle had long said, his notion that the parts were perhaps even more important than the whole. The crocodile instead mitigated against this fate. In contrast to the fragility of most animals that entered the early modern museum, it was one of the most durable objects that collectors transformed into a museum artifact. And this, I think, is another reason why Alfred Jarry contemplated the crocodile in the early 1900s. The crocodile was the memory of the museum, a mute witness to centuries of the human folly of collecting. Even today, if you go to Palazzo Poggi in Bologna, where there is a reconstruction of the Studio Aldrovandi, you can still see two crocodiles there today in its reconstruction. So it too is one of the many places we can catalog, these crocodiles. Now, part of the difference, to return to Durer's rhinoceros, part of the difference between Durer's rhinoceros and Imperato's crocodile lay in the fact that Dürer drew an animal, as a number of you probably know, that he not only never saw, but that few people in his part of the world saw. By contrast, the crocodile was more than simply an infinitely reproducible image. It was also an artifact to possess. With some regularity, people talked about the fact that more and more of these crocodiles were available by the late 16th century, right, in the very decades that the portrait of Imperato's crocodile appears. This is a world in which merchants supplied Nile crocodiles to the curious in the markets of Venice, where exotic things from the East were bought and sold in enormous supply, right, in one of the world's great emporia. And early examples of New World alligators and caimans and iguanas began to make their appearance in cities such as Seville and Antwerp. And here again, just to get you thinking about how this moves forward, let me show you the canonical image of one of the famous botanical gardens that had a cabinet of curiosities. This is the Leiden Botanical Garden. It's one of the earliest images, right, we have of a botanic garden. And of course, what is at the center of this is the image of the garden. But then in this cartouche below, right, are the images of certain canonical objects. When you have, a sea tortoise all the way on the far end, And then you have, this crocodilian specimen that is most likely an alligator, of course. I mean, I think if one looks closely at it, you perhaps even see certain aspects of it that suggest that, though it's not inclined to be anatomically detailed enough to be absolutely sure. So part of my supposition also comes from ways of knowing, just like the surviving example in a Portuguese church is indicated as coming from India, and that's not surprising when you know something about the Portuguese Empire, that the Spanish examples come overwhelmingly from the Americas, right? The English examples, the Dutch examples overwhelmingly from the Americas, and instead the Italian ones overwhelmingly are coming from Africa, right, or, the East, in this classic older sense. The crocodile, in short, belonged not only to a past that I'm going to talk about, but also to this dynamic, expanding world of goods in the early modern era. Its importance to the image of the early modern cabinet invites us to consider other aspects of its significance. What were readers of early modern catalogs supposed to understand when they saw or read about the crocodile in the museum? And how did representations of the crocodile reflect its scientific importance to Renaissance natural history, and more generally, its cultural meaning? At the beginning of the 16th century, and again, as I'm kind of going through this, let me just give you, just thinking about just the world of these cabinets that is represented here. At the beginning of the 16th century, naturalists and artists developed a description of the crocodile that was increasingly attentive to the renewed interest in the natural world, but did not begin there, right? Began in other contexts. So now let me quote somebody who did not have a cabinet and predates this, which is the early 16th century Dutch humanist Erasmus, who offered the following observation on the Renaissance fascination with the crocodile. "What will it profit you to utter a syllogism on the crocodile," Erasmus wrote, "if you do not know whether it is a kind of plant or an animal?" Here we see Erasmus gently poking fun at contemporaries' fascination with arcane wisdom, which was closely associated with knowledge of the crocodile. Erasmus nonetheless contrasted this approach to knowledge with a more empirical understanding of nature itself. Nature's symbolism, he suggested, should be in harmony with nature's science. Such an attitude reflected a newly critical approach to ancient texts, such as Pliny's Natural History, Marco Polo's travels, and of course Mandeville, all of which discuss the crocodile, which provided the standard descriptions of many animals for Renaissance readers, and the basic ingredients for the allegorical understanding of nature that had been developed in the tradition of the medieval bestiaries. And needless to say, the bestiary crocodile can be found in many, many places in many, many different guises that invoke not only these sources, but key passages in the Bible, right? From Job, from Revelations, especially. So here we see the bestiary crocodile, right? Swallowing, a man whole, presumably a man, all we see are the legs, who then will cry, of course, the crocodilian tears afterwards as one of the things that he becomes known for. Or most famously, the image of the hydrus, right? That willingly rolls itself in mud to be swallowed by the crocodile. This is not a very crocodile-looking crocodile with its donkey ears. I mean, you again can discuss what kind of beast this is supposed to be, but the salient fact, as we see in this image, of course, is that the hydra is one of two animals that can eat its way out, can itself destroy the crocodile, right? It's a willing sacrifice, because in fact it is no sacrifice, unlike the human, who's devoured in the previous picture. So the bestiary crocodiles also are an interesting starting point for the kind of material that is gravitating and migrating and being transformed because of a broadening interest in the actual animal world that these very allegorical images, religious or antiquarian, represented. Right, so all this is to say that before the crocodile enters the cabinet, its significance had to be established outside of the museum. So this is a great object lesson, right, in understanding how we write the history, of material culture. Erasmus's question about the crocodile, plant or animal, suggests that it was in the early decades of the 16th century, as Western Europeans traveled to many different parts of the world with greater frequency and brought back what they found, that the crocodile found its place in Renaissance learned and popular culture, reanimating a kind of medieval interest and connecting it to an interest in even older texts as well. It is possible, for instance, that Erasmus was thinking of an anecdote that was told by Leo Africanus about a man who mistook a crocodile for a piece of wood and died while attempting to cross the Nile on its back. One of the reasons that Renaissance naturalists found the crocodile to be a striking object was its presence in the oldest and the newest parts of the world, then under exploration. When Erasmus joked about the crocodile plant, he satirized a confusing reality about the natural world for 16th century observers. The alligators of the Indies, described, for instance, by Gonzalo Fernando de Oviedo at the beginning of the 16th century as allegedly growing to the fantastic length of over 100 feet in the vicinity of Panama, were initially no different to Renaissance observers than the Egyptian crocodiles that the French naturalist Pierre Bellon had described in some detail after traveling to Egypt in the 1540s, seeing them for himself, right? Not just reading about them in Pliny or Herodotus or any of these other texts that you could read about them over the centuries. By 1595, the German naturalist Joachim Camerarius the Younger summed up the Renaissance image of the crocodile in his important emblem book on animals when he described it, as he put it, as an animal that inhabits Egypt and India. And here I want to just take a little excursion again through some of the images I've been collecting over my long meandering interest in the crocodile. The Egyptian crocodiles we can find in many, many ways. This image of Horus standing on a sacred crocodile, very, very old image. So these are, here again, to kind of give you some examples of Egyptian crocodile imagery, right? Depiction of a crocodile spell in Ptolemaic Egypt. And here you see the, say, unlike that bestiary image, right, the enormous detail, right, to physically depict something that is recognizably a crocodile, in all of its particularity in this image, right? Real knowledge of the crocodile. And let us not forget, for those of us interested in crocodile remains, that one of the reasons we have so many surviving papyri is because, yes, they were used to preserve mummified crocodiles, right, stuffed inside them. And so there are these wonderful surviving examples of ancient Egyptian crocodiles, that are, came with the paper, that we are much more interested in than the objects themselves. By the late 16th century, avid readers of natural histories and travel journals had significantly more information about the crocodile than Erasmus could have imagined at the beginning of the 16th century. For instance, in a book called On Monsters and Marvels, the French royal surgeon Ambroise Paré collected all of the best stories about crocodiles told in both the Old and the New Worlds, including a spectacular description of the procedure by which Egyptians captured Nile crocodiles by attaching a piece of animal flesh to an iron hook, which I think fascinatingly recalls that passage in Job, right, about how you capture Leviathan. Once the crocodile took the lure, they pulled it to shore and, suspending it in midair over a palm tree, as he described, beat the crocodile to death. Jose Acosta may have well had this description of the Nile crocodile in his mind when, in his Natural History of the Indies, he admired the skills of the native inhabitants of the Americas in capturing the alligator by thrusting a log down its throat and flipping it over for the kill. This is something that then is illustrated in later editions of Acosta, not in the original version. Or perhaps we should recall the French Huguenot Jean Delarey's 1578 description, not of the crocodile per se, but of the native inhabitants of Brazil, the Tupinamba, who allegedly ate the flesh of crocodiles, as thick as a man's thigh and correspondingly long, he wrote, and raised them live in their homes. And now we need to keep in mind Leviticus, right, where the crocodile was one of the prohibited things that one should not eat. So here we see an interesting mingling, right, of the kind of world of observing nature, observing what people do with nature in a world, right, of, a world instead of the, of people observing, this world of pagans, right, who, among other things, eat the crocodile. The increased appearance of such stories served to enhance the image of the crocodile as an animal that required all of human ingenuity to possess, and evoke the dangers of a predatory and ancient, but also novel beast. Such an animal deserved a rich and exciting iconography, and deserved to be possessed. One of the locations in which the crocodile began to make its appearance was in the margins of maps that not only captured a new sense of space, but also established how animals themselves represented the world as it was now coming into focus. And here, if I move forward a bit, I want to give you this image from Walter Raleigh of the river of the Lagartos, the river of lizards. Again, he's now borrowing Spanish terms about lizards, which is the terms they often use to describe the alligators, sometimes the iguanas, other things that they see as equivalent vocabulary. The crocodiles that had sporadically appeared on medieval maps occupied a more prominent place in Renaissance cartography. Cartographers made them the symbol of Africa around the same time that Imperato's crocodile first made its appearance in the cabinet, usually reserving instead the armadillo for America, because the crocodile's associations with the Old World had preceded its discovery in the New. Though over time this would change, and this is one of the things that this wonderful Yale student has written about, is sort of observing how by the end of the 17th century we begin to see both Africa and the Americas being represented, sometimes represented together, and straddling. Basically, by the 17th century, one of the things that happens in this iconography is that Africa becomes the elephant and America becomes the alligator, though the alligator is as much as naturalist of the Americas described by the 18th century, an alligator crocodile, right? Though some debate and try to think about the distinctions as well. The more the crocodile became an image of a continent, the more the traditional idea of Africa as the fertile mother of monsters and theater of marvels, as naturalists wrote, made the crocodile the origin of all that was unusual and aberrant about this oldest part of the natural world. Geographically comprehensive in a way that few other artifacts could be, the crocodile was the ideal transitional object of the first global age. It tacitly confirmed Columbus's supposition that the Indies were just another route to reach those ancient civilizations filled with the marvels of the East. It was exotic enough to be displayed not only in museums, but also in public fairs, street entertainments, and became a standard animal in many Renaissance emblem books. And here, let me offer some from Camerarius the Younger, from his book of animal emblems. In short, the crocodile became an object that demanded the full array of interpretive skills possessed by the collector. Late Renaissance naturalists did not hesitate to meet this challenge. By the 16th century, the crocodile enjoyed a host of associations that made it one of the symbolically rich objects in the museum, in addition to being visually compelling. Ancient natural history provided the framework, which early modern readers elaborated on and improved. Aristotle, for example, had singled out the crocodile for its immobile lower jaw, its pig eyes, strong teeth and skin, poor eyesight underwater, and astronomical growth from birth to death, and finally, the absence of a tongue. So all of these become things to debate. In other words, it's an anomalous quadruped, right, in Aristotle's terms, whose amphibious existence had a great deal to do with what Aristotle termed its indistinct formation. These kinds of characteristics were further reinforced in the great Roman encyclopedia, right, in Pliny the Elder's Natural History, which additionally emphasized the evil of the crocodile, right, begins to moralize it. These two descriptions, along with Herodotus, Marco Polo, Mandeville, the bestiaries, and of course the passages from the Bible I've begun to allude to, shaped the natural history of the crocodile for over 2,000 years. So what was the crocodile before it entered the museum? The nature and habits of the crocodile had been a source of moral allegories, especially during the Middle Ages. So how did early modern collectors think about these issues? Well, one of the interesting places to look at this is actually in the attempts to reform religious iconography in the Catholic world by the end of the 16th century, again in the world that Imperato inhabits. So in 1581, the Archbishop of Bologna, the city in which Ulisse Aldrovandi had created one of the great theaters of nature, named Gabriele Paleotti, one of Aldrovandi's patrons, wrote a book that he called The Discourses on Sacred and Profane Images, or at least we should say he wrote part of a book in 1581, half of which survives and has been put into a modern edition, and the other half instead survives as an outline of the book that was never written. And inside that outline, we find a sketch of a chapter that he hoped to write, though he never got to, about all of the things to be found in churches, including crocodiles, arms, narwhal horns, ostrich eggs, and other foreign animals. Paleotti described them as summed up this cluster of objects as things that suit churches, right? So that is where the crocodile has been sitting prior to the emergence of the Cabinet of Curiosities in the 16th century. In this cluster of objects, things that suit churches. Yeah, prior to its arrival in the museum, the crocodile had been a common object, religious object, the only dragon that one could really capture. And here I just again wanted to give you a taste of these objects. This is the most famously discussed of all of these surviving church crocodiles, the one in Santa Maria delle Grazie in Mantua. You can still see this today. It was restored around 2001. And these images, we'll see how well they reproduce, because I haven't gone to take my own images, so they're a little bit fuzzy, but you can see the crocodile is looking better than it did, say when I was a grad student. It's gotten a little, the tail is lifted up a bit, etc. And then you get and it's right in the central apse of the church, right? So again, to sort of think about this as a starting point for this whole story. Recounting the arrival of a crocodile in Santa Maria delle Grazie, one of the Franciscan monks described its unexpected appearance in a lake near the holy site, commenting, "God knows how to have crocodiles and every other sort of fiercer animal discovered wherever he pleases." The crocodile was considered, in other words, to be a peculiarly mobile object, moved by the hand of God, a true ex voto. So the crocodile was many, many things, right? The crocodile was the dragon slayed by St. George and a number of other states, the dragon that ate St. Margaret, the dragon that we should fear, the idolatrous dragon, right? But it was also pagan and pleasurable, an idol of other kinds that invoked other traditions as well. Here in the case of Seville, we have a wooden crocodile. Perhaps there had been an original crocodile. I think there was. It was a crusading artifact, as I recall, that is, perhaps brought to this church, I think, in the 13th century, towards the end of the Crusades. It's not surprising, by the way, that there are more of these crocodiles surviving in Spanish churches than anywhere else, with Italy being second. So here, here this, literally becomes a simulacra, right, of the original object. And we can kind of quickly see, and I'll move back to this in a second, how these things then begin to appear in a place that combines both. The Roman College Museum, which is the principal museum of the Jesuits inside this principal educational institution founded in the 16th century. Museum instead is founded in 1651, and comes to have a crocodile in it, as we see in this catalog here from 1678. Now, many 16th and 17th century museums explicitly alluded to the religious connotations of the crocodile hanging from its ceiling, exactly as it had hung in church, with heavy chains, facing downward in a predatory stance. The corner is a little small there. If you look what, for me, is, yes, the far left corner in the middle, you'll see the hanging crocodile, and this is instead the crocodile in the catalog. They're not the same. I'm thinking a little bit more about this image, and I think this one, because it's done in Amsterdam, by his Dutch publisher Janssen. I think that this image is actually instead inspired by the images of the alchemical dragons that were made famous by David Teniers the Younger, that usually are based on iguanas. And so this is kind of a great place where we see this kind of wonderful combination of one form of representation, that takes one animal, another form that takes another animal that we might say is more recognizably, crocodilian, and combines all these different features, but nonetheless replicates, right, the medieval meaning of it by hanging it exactly, say, as it's hung in Santa Maria delle Grazie. In fact, if you look at this, this is literally a hanging, the vaulted ceiling has representations, astrological, cosmological representations of the heavens, so really it is representing the crocodile as something that is, coming from, connected to, right, the heavens. By the end of the 17th century, museum catalogers had begun to reflect on the historical evolution of the objects in their collections, recording as many different interpretations as possible for their readers. And so this is when I think the crocodile becomes a truly historical object for us to think about. The placement of the crocodile itself became a subject for commentary in some catalogs. So for instance, in the 1677 catalog to the Museum of Ferdinando Cospi in Bologna, the author of the catalog, Lorenzo Legati, recorded 2 reasons why crocodiles were suspended from ceilings. The first, which I think more or less is a kind of, modification of things he found in Aesop's fables, was that he thought crocodiles were there to keep away mice, right, to protect the other objects in the collection that were much more fragile and vulnerable, due, as he wrote, to the natural enmity between these 2 animals, which I've read nowhere else, right? The natural enmity is, with the hydras, or with this kind of dolphin-like sawfish, right, that cuts open the stomach. This is the only place I've ever seen this, but maybe if I go back to Aesop, I'll discover I'm wrong, But I think the point he wanted to make in this instance was that the crocodile need not only be a kind of fearsome dragon that we loathed and feared and had captured, had conquered, right? But the crocodile could also be a kind of guardian, had a positive valence. It could be a guardian of the museum, placed aloft to eternally watch over the other objects that were more fragile, of course, than itself. And we see this also in the catalog of the Sedalla collection in Milan, where the author writes that the crocodile, as he puts it, is one of the immortal cadavers of the gallery, further underscoring the notion that the crocodile might well outlast even the collector, a permanent testimonial to the wonder and eternity of nature. The second reason Legati invoked in his catalog of the Cosmi Museum returned to the religious meaning of the medieval crocodile, now transformed into an early modern emblem. And some of you may already recall that emblem books are a great Renaissance invention, and it is all about allegorizing behavior, but also objects, many, many things. It takes all the aphorisms of, the ancient and medieval world and expands them, immensely in every possible direction. So Legati goes into one of the emblem books in his library and pulls out an emblem that has been written for his time, obviously, because what it says is as follows: "Suspended in the sanctuary, the crocodile is placed on high, enclosed so that the noxious monster is in his sight. Thus terrifying evil is the habit of evil. Thus the wickedness of customs is the enemy of evil. Conquering evil by having evil, by possessing it, by putting it inside, in this case, your collection," right? But he's talking about a church. He's talking about a sanctuary, like Santa Maria delle Grazie. In a book entitled On the Symbolic Wisdom of the Egyptians, written in 1631, the Jesuit Nicolas Cossan wrote, "The crocodile is the sign of all evils." Now, Legati did not suggest that museum visitors necessarily experienced these emotions when they viewed the crocodiles in the Cospi collection. After all, this statement came from the pen of a man who wrote that touching crocodiles' teeth did not lessen one's sorrows, right? So he actually counters other ancient myths of the crocodile that had evolved, especially in the world of the medieval bestiaries. What he primarily, I think, wanted them to be aware of was the historical value of this object, that the crocodile was indeed an object of many meanings, that it had many lives, and that was why it was now in the cabinet. Within the crocodile, in other words, lay the entire history of collecting. Now, let me again give you this nice image of the alchemical lizard. This is one of many. David Teniers paints something like 300 images of alchemists in one form or another. I've just chosen one to give you the alchemical lizard or iguana. We should really call it the alchemical iguana. And this is the kind of image that, again, has repurposed. It's changed the animal, it's repurposed the whole function of this. He also does one image of surgeons also, where they're in a kind of collecting space. In many ways, that one is now not drawing off the churches, but drawing off what I call the apothecary alligator that Shakespeare, among others, makes famous in Romeo and Juliet. So there are all these ways in which the cabinet becomes a kind of place for all these different kinds of images. And this, again, to show you the long afterlife of the alchemical dragon is a late 18th century print. And you can see, again, it's inspired by the paintings by Teniers and others, but especially by Teniers, that you see, this, clearly this is an alchemist. There are all the retorts, there's the alchemist, and then above a set of animals, including the crocodile, not specially privileged in this instance, but including the crocodile, of course, or the alligator, we should say, perhaps, and more likely in this particular case. And I think did I do one other? Yes, one more of these kind of images. All right, well, so let me kind of bring this now to, where I'd like to, to pull a different strand of this together as we watch this migrating object that really is many objects with many, many meanings. By the time Legatti recorded the description of his crocodile of 1677, it had become a cultural and philosophical as well as religious artifact, an artifact to discuss and ponder much more than a portent, as it had been in the Middle Ages. During the mid-16th century, when crocodiles first began to appear in inventories of homes, learned Europeans also began to actively cultivate their passion for things Egyptian. In other words, one of the reasons the crocodile is particularly so ubiquitous in places like Italy and southern France is its Mediterranean nature, right? And now I am talking about the crocodile and not the iguana, not the alligator, etc. The Egyptian mania, of the early modern world had multiplied in many different ways images of Egypt, and with this, images of the crocodile. So let's take a quick look at a few of these, very informally. I'm not trying to do, a full study of these, but just to kind of bring them into the conversation. For instance, iconic, the Vatican Nile River god. We spend a lot of time on the god, but in fact, we also need to look at what the putti are holding and trying to open the mouth of, right? They're playing with the crocodile. Because the crocodile, of course, is the symbol of Egypt much more than Africa, right, in this particular valence. And this is the kind of imagery that also is picked up, say, by Rubens, right, in his image of the hippopotamus and the crocodile hunt. So a lot of the literature, the sort of emblematic image of the crocodile, is especially focused on how to capture this image of it as an Egyptian artifact, as the symbol of Egypt. But read, of course, through the lens of Aristotle and Pliny and the many other references I've been talking about. Now, again, one of the other places to see this was not just in fabulous sculpture like the Nile River god, but in much more ordinary antiquarian objects, Roman coins, right? Crocodiles were triumphal objects that symbolized the capture of Egypt. And this was one of the tangible ways, that they were quite aware of this, as well as in texts that described, the Roman conquest of Egypt. And this actually is interestingly replicated, for instance, in the way in which a crocodile is given to the Aldrovandi collection in the middle of the 17th century, in the very period that Legatti is writing his account of this other famous collection in Bologna. I think it's in 1649, one of the Bolognese noblemen decides to give a crocodile to the museum, and they make a massive public spectacle of this, and it's carried on fronds across the central piazza of the city, like a Roman triumphal object, and then deposited into the cabinet in all these different ways. And so again, to return to one of the collections I pointed to, the collection of Athanasius Kircher inside this Jesuit museum in the Roman College, we need to now sort of think about this probably Dutch-inspired alchemical lizard that is depicted there that may have nothing to do with the actual crocodiles in his museum in terms of what inspired its iconography, but has everything to do, on the other side, with what it's behind, right, in the way this image is done, which is one of these aggrandized obelisks. We actually found these obelisks were found in the basement of the original Roman college building many years ago now, and we now know they're really very short. Actually, they're not like that. They're like things we could put on the table here. So this is that's a whole other story, right, about the obelisk replicas. Kierkegaard is the great obelisk consultant. So this is one of the primary ways where his role as the great Baroque Egyptologist is represented, but the juxtaposition, right, of the obelisk and the crocodile in this is also trying in the 1678 catalog to really kind of connect these things and connect them fundamentally. And here again, I'm going to kind of turn to these images, to the role of the crocodile in representing the knowledge that he deciphers, right? I mean, to rest, this image of, the crocodile as a pedestal on which the revelation of this ancient wisdom of the Egyptians, unfolds. The crocodile is literally the base of the entire story of engaging with ancient wisdom. So in this Roman world especially, the crocodile becomes a especially meaningful object in ways that have, say, no valence in a place like London or Seville, right, or Marseille, but have been everything in this particular context. I mean, everything to this particular collector because of the way he's brought these things together, and are captured by the Dutch publisher and the engravers in Amsterdam, who are largely responsible for this image making from the reading of his works. As we see, for instance, in this image from 1677, that is a whole summary by one of Kierkegaard's disciples of what Kierkegaardian studies are all about. And once again, we see, the role of the crocodile, as the base, right, from which the human understanding, right, of this Prisca Sapientia, unfolds. So I want here, at the end of my talk, to return to the image that I started with, which is the image of Imperato's crocodile. As I've suggested, it's not only all the places the crocodile has been, but all the places the crocodile goes from the cabinet that is part of the history of this story. If we look at the frontispiece of Imperato's book, we see an interesting clue for why the crocodile is so important to the cabinet itself and to the history of this author, of this apothecary, right, as a great collector of nature. Because there actually are two crocodiles, right? There's the crocodile of the cabinet. This is iconically reproduced as one of the most famous images of the cabinets of curiosities. And then there's the image that no one but, I think, me, has actually spent time thinking about, which is the other crocodile that's on the frontispiece that holds this little banner that says, in dies auctior, which you could translate a variety of ways, but fundamentally is recapitulating one of the things we know about the natural history of the crocodile as it was told since Aristotle: daily I grow bigger, daily I increase, it is increased. Just as the crocodile grows continuously from the first to the last day of his life, so does the museum increase. The crocodile, in this wonderful emblem of a collector in Naples, must inhabit the museum because it is a natural cornucopia. It is a cabinet of curiosities unto itself. The crocodile was the ultimate commentary on the museum. It was a collector's joke, but also truly a description of a collection. Now, by the end of the 17th century, all of this wonderful allegorizing of the crocodile in many different venues, had instead resolved itself in various ways in images like this image of the Royal Society crocodile, which, as Spencer Weinreich talks about in his paper, is described as a crocodile or leviathan, invoking the British traditions of natural theology, of reading the Bible, looking for the Bible, in a literal understanding of nature. And yet, at the same time, right, in this kind of interesting Protestant afterlife of what had been a highly Catholic artifact in its earlier generation, we see also the way in which we're moving towards the discussion in which we will begin to separate out what is a crocodile, what is an alligator, what is an iguana, what are each of these different things. Not because they absolutely have to be separated, but because the inclination ultimately will be to not describe it as the alligator crocodile, the leviathan crocodile, the indeterminate object that is absolutely everything in its cornucopic nature. But there's also another afterlife I want to point to, and I owe this to my colleague who's a historian of popular medicine in this period, Mary Fussell, who's worked a lot on a best-selling sex manual known as Aristotle's Masterpiece. Not written by Aristotle, I should add, but attributed to him throughout the centuries, was a bestseller all the way through the 19th century in places like the Americas as well as Britain. And it's in the 18th century that these spurious works of Aristotle, of his secrets, of his masterpiece, included the image of Aristotle as a man who inhabited a cabinet in which above there was a crocodile. If we think about the crocodiles of the modern natural history museums, this is the more likely place that we will find them because they belong to an entirely different post-Darwinian narrative about nature. And it is instead not that many subway stops away from us, something that inspired my interest in this whole subject as a kid growing up around New York, that this is the artifact that we would like to put intact in our natural history museums on the ceiling. Thank you very much. I look forward to questions.
Thank you very much, and the floor is now, in fact, those of you who have been watching, wherever you are, and if you wish to tweet in questions, it's hashtag BardGradCenterTV, hashtag BardGradCenterTV, and we'll check and filter your questions through. Please, Karen.
Well, this is pretty much off topic, but I just wanted to mention that when I was coming up here, I was waiting for the C train at 14th Street, and they have all those little, I guess, bronze sculptures throughout the station. And I happened to be standing next to one, which was an alligator coming up out of the sewer. You could see the top of the sewer on his head, devouring a man, and the man, what was left of him, had a kind of money bags on his head with dollar signs on it. And so it was a sort of like a moral, the alligator as an agent of morality in this. Someone else probably knows exactly when these sculptures were done and by whom, I don't, but it seemed to me.
It's like a Gilded Age rereading of, it's not that period, I'm just going to call it that, but it's a modern rereading of a capitalist rereading, right, of the medieval vesture, of the crocodile that devours. That's great. You prove my point. People always think of key examples. This is why I never publish this paper. I'm always waiting for the next great story about what the crocodile is. Or the alligator.
Well, maybe to that point, there's a portrait of the 17th century English collector, Sir William Paston, that has a little figure of a man running away from a crocodile in an exotic place with palm trees behind. And Paston did travel as far as Cairo and Jerusalem in his travels. But there's no stuffed alligator in any of the inventories of his remaining inventories in his collection. So I just wonder, I wanted to ask you anyway, actually, because I'm quite interested in the painting, the image of somebody running away from a crocodile, is that, do you know where that might occur in the emblem literature or anything like that?
I haven't, and it may just be missing, I haven't seen one where somebody specifically talks about well, let me think about it for a second. I haven't seen an image of somebody specifically running away as opposed to the capture of it, the slaying of the dragon, these other things that people, keep reproducing over and over again. That being said, I'm trying to think of it's in Marco Polo, right, where he talks about what he calls the crocodiles of China, yeah, I mean, there are certainly accounts, right, of that sort of how do you escape the crocodile? That question of how can you survive the crocodile is of interest. So I don't know. Does he write a travel journal? I mean, I wonder if it's referring to some specific episode that.
Well, I wondered whether it was a reference to his travels or if it was emblematic, a reference to his collecting of exotica and so forth. I simply don't know.
Yeah.
But no, he hasn't left any. There are a few letters, but no accounts of escapes from crocodiles.
Yeah, but somehow it sounds like the painting records something that must have been there, even if it's something that corroborates doesn't survive, right, as part of that right, the story of the man who goes to Egypt, and certainly, I think it is almost ubiquitous that everyone who goes to Egypt has to, I mean, especially if you have any interest in natural history, has to talk about, actually encountering not the dead and stuffed, but the living, crocodile, because it's just so iconic to show that you truly have been there. So maybe this is trying to kind of capture that it's a panorama of truly having been there. That, just like those images of the Americas of the, log rolling alligator caiman, etc. The lagartos, the leg of the lagartos.
Thank you.
There's a question right behind you.
The sculptures are by Tom Otterness, I think. But my question is, in the slide that you showed of the crocodile, I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the, sort of like a spell, crocodile spell. Do you know if that was a pro-crocodile, like come hither, or go away, or keep calm? Do you know what the spell was meant to do?
I can remember now. It is designed, I'm pretty sure it's designed to, exactly, how do you calm the crocodile, right? So again, it's tied to that sort of how, and one of the things I didn't have time, to discuss in this is also the many different medicinal uses of different parts of the crocodile, that are discussed. Pliny, I think, might be one of the first to discuss these, and then you see this in all sorts of places. I mean, the crocodilian-like things are, that, you grind up their skin, you put it in vinegar, you put it in oil, their bladder is supposed to have all these kind of properties. So I think this other thing too, that one can in some way manipulate the matter of the crocodile for your own end. I think this issue with the spell is also, that, right, that many different ways one can tame this part of nature that seems to be able to can overcome you if one can't, obviously. But thank you for that. Yeah.
I was struck by what you said about how Europeans are much more familiar with the crocodile than with like the rhinoceros. Yet in the imagery they look so varied, and I was thinking, is this because they're trying to reconcile a crocodile, an alligator, an iguana, etc., or how about the taxidermy of the actual crocodile?
Mm-hmm.
Are there good taxidermies and bad false taxidermies? Or?
Yeah, that's a fun question to think about. Okay, here's a bit more of elaboration on this. Is that so if you think about a kind of benchmark, right? Before 1500, seeing the alligator that came in is not something in this particular part of the world, right? So that's not. So instead, for them, it's not the Indies broadly, but India, or Marco Polo's China that they think of when they think of the crocodiles that are beyond the African, Egyptian, the Mediterranean crocodiles that they have in mind. And so not surprisingly, it's English collectors and naturalists who will, and I think their Dutch counterparts as well, who will talk more about, use the term alligator, for instance, right? John Tredskin talks about an alligator. Shakespeare talks about an alligator, though he also talks about crocodiles. And so you see people sort of wondering about this, and this leads to, I think, two different impulses, and one is the impulse of physical description, which ultimately is that impulse to separate and distinguish all of these things, and to say, okay, this one, in an alligator, it has a recessed lower jaw. It's the lower teeth are not going to be as visible, whereas in the crocodile, they'll be slightly visible. How thick is the tail? The differences in the snout. I mean, but that's something that is only fully, I think, articulated somewhere between the late 18th and 19th century in the treatment of these objects. So we can, in a way, conclude that they could have gone further in that direction. They don't. And then this issue about the taxidermy of it. We don't, very rarely do you have people discussing the preparation of the specimens. It's a kind of craft secret in many ways, right? Just like how do you retain the color in pressing flowers, for instance? How do you preserve nature? These are or anatomical specimens too, right? Real craft secrets for people who do this well. And then there's the artfulness of what they're trying to do to combine these things, right? For the people who basically bring the beasts of the bestiary, the mythical beast, to life by artfully combining bits of, a lizard, a fish, they make the dragon, right? I've written about the basilisk as a great example of this, where people literally make basilisks because they want them to be real objects, and they don't want to just simply identify it with some object that partly fits the description. So that's a kind of interesting place where you see, you know, you actually see a bit of the discussion of the taxidermy of the object more than in the objects of this kind. I mean, people will talk about what they, you know, what do you put inside and how do you transport them, you know, across the, you know, every once in a while travelers will talk about this more, how do they transport things, but not often enough to have a consistent sense of this. So, you know, so what I find generally is that overwhelmingly, the bulk of the description of these objects is much more biblical, emblematic, allegorical. You know, there's much more, and then they bring the natural historical to bear on these things, right? Or then, if they wish to, where the other place you see is if they wish to debate some aspect of the natural history, right, some aspect of what Aristotle or some other scientific authority said, then you begin to see people, they won't necessarily refer to a specific specimen, they'll say, no, I've counted the number of teeth and it's not 60, or my favorite one where you know, people have basically turned the crocodile rightfully, you know, given its biblical meaning into the sign of the beast, right, where it's 66, no, it has 62, not, you know, they go through why 66 is not the number of the crocodile, because they're basically naturalizing, right, its meaning at that point with physical description. So that's the kind of thing you end up seeing. Yeah.
If I could just jump in on that point and encourage you to go further in this nominalist direction. I mean, we were talking a little bit about crocodiles versus alligators, but I'm wondering if from the perspectives of the mythological or mystical or symbolical or pharmaceutical, whether there might also be differences in different cities or different countries. So you were talking, for instance, about the ritual celebration in Bologna of the presentation of crocodile. But in Marseille, which I know well from this period, there are lots of crocodiles that are coming on ships all the time. Nobody seems to care that much. There are even protocols for the restoration of crocodiles that fall into the sea when ships sink. Perez doesn't have a crocodile drawn, even as he has other animals that come from Africa drawn, which suggests that it's a kind of a commonplace thing. So could we map attitudes in Europe in a way through crocodiles, or does it flatten out into all the same?
That's a great question. It's one this is kind of the next phase of what I'm thinking about. I want to put into this paper. And your comment about Perez not drawing the crocodile is great, because by contrast, and you know this, you know, even better than I do, right, when there's this discussion about the hippo in some of his correspondence, or hippopotamus, he says, you know, he talks about the last time somebody saw a live specimen, which was quite a while ago. You know, he's talking with Cassiano del Pozzo, that's why I read this, and, you know, instead, you know, he's got, you know, they've got the teeth, but, you know, seeing a live hippopotamus is exactly the opposite of the crocodile. So, you know, it's very rare, right? I mean, it's like the rhinoceros. This is very rare, the likelihood that one would survive. And that's why, of course, the story of Durer's rhinoceros or the Pope's elephant that Silvio Badini told in this delightful book many years ago becomes so that, you know, that they had actually arrived, or the oryx or these other animals, right, of, you know, North Africa, the Barbary coast that are coming to Marseille, that Perez is so interested in sharing with his friends in Rome and other places as well. And so I agree with you. I think that one of the things I've been arriving at with this project is to think a little bit more about the geography. And I want to pay more attention to exactly this. Why is there a kind of density of discussion in certain places of this and not in others? And so that, say, for instance, you know, one of the things one could say is that in the Iberian world, you have this concentration of these kind of the afterlife of the crusading medieval artifact. But it's not connected, as far as I can tell, in a strong way to this burgeoning set of descriptions now a number of centuries later of you know, the alligator, the caiman, etc. They're not, you know, they're not connected in a strong way, other than perhaps say through the missionary image that yes, idolatry is everywhere, the crocodile, the dragon is everywhere, right? You know, and we need to conquer it. But it doesn't seem to kind of strongly yield this, say, this ritualized ceremonial culture of crocodiles that we see in Italy. So then I have to conclude, which is in a way why I ended with my friend Kierkegaard, is that part of what's missing is this kind of intense antiquarian impulse on top of the religious context and on top of the rich culture of natural history. And in the same way, this is something I want to talk with, my young colleague at Yale about from his work, where he's looked more at the sort of 17th through 18th century English writings on these things and combined it with a bit of the other stuff, is that this discussion of the crocodile as Leviathan, I think, is a product of Protestant natural theology. I mean, it's not that it's not there in these medieval and Renaissance Catholic traditions, but it's not emphasized, and of course it could have been, right? I mean, but instead, it's that world that invents natural theology as a Protestant science, which is a world of the late 17th, through 19th centuries, that I think really, takes an intense interest in that. So in a way, you can, if you think about this as an exercise in how do we write the history of objects, right? So one is, what are the different ways in which an artifact emerges, right, and has a textual and a visual tradition, and the other is, what survives and why, right? What really was, how did the traffic in this artifact flow? And that's where I do really want to think about this issue of the port cities and how I can, capture better why a crocodile in Marseille can fall off a ship and, you just need to restore it to sell it. You're not going to, write a whole story about it, right? Or make a big picture or any kind of, really take note of it beyond that, because every day there are crocodiles on ships. But I think in this other, it is an interesting question, because these are not hard to find objects. I mean, I'm forgetting who it is, but one of the playwrights, not Shakespeare and not Johnson either, one of the playwrights of the era of Shakespeare, Johnson, writes a play in the early 1580s where he talks about these arriving more often. Well, why in 1582 do you think they're arriving more often? Well, the Virginia Company, the East India Company, I mean, there are some very real commercial reasons, right? So I want to connect the story. I think the issue of geography is a combination of religion and commerce, as well as, where are objects displayed, what purposes do these kinds of displays serve?
Have you seen any interesting examples of live crocodiles showing up?
Read
I
my
mean,
mind.
in menageries, I mean, not that I know of, I haven't come across anything, but they seem to all be protected.
They seem to all be stuffed, and there could be, there's certainly no menageries all over, but the question of how you keep the crocodile, how you transport it alive. That's problem number one. You could, it's a little tiny baby, you could, but they do grow, and and they require a lot of food, and that's a problem. It's much easier to, even transporting small animals.
They had transported turtles.
Yeah.
They kept them alive and used them for eating.
Exactly.
For nutrition.
Exactly. No, and even because especially with these kinds of long, this issue of transport.
Yeah.
It must have happened. It must have happened. But you're absolutely right. It is worth saying. It's not like in my kind of eclectic research on this, I've come across lots of descriptions of the living crocodile. Instead, let me tell you further detail of one story, which is related to Kierkegaard's crocodiles. So people know he would like, in the 1650s, more of this particular artifact. So one of this young German prince, who's the heir to the Duchy of Lüneburg, who is also a Catholic convert, so they have a particularly close relationship. And he's in Venice, and he's been trying to find a really good crocodile specimen to send back to his mentor in Rome, his confessor, mentor in Rome, Kierkegaard. And he writes this great letter, which is why I know about this, and they then write up, he does eventually find one that they then write up in the catalog. So this is one instance where I have more than usual, it's a more dynamic story, much like the story in Bologna of the gift of the crocodile of circa 1649. So he writes and he says, I've been looking around Venice, and I haven't found a crocodile worthy of you. And he describes one without a head and another one that the tail is kind of broken. And he says, look, I'm not going to send either of these. So what that tells us is, much like the shop, right, in Paris, that you found yours in, that we were talking about before this started, it tells us, right, that there are big surprise in this, Mediterranean emporium of Venice. There are places one goes in which there are multiple specimens, and at the moment when this German prince is there and nosing around in the shops, the best ones are gone. So he waits because he knows that more are coming, right? He knows that more are coming. But he certainly doesn't suggest, needless to say, that any of them are alive. These are the, the broken, remains.
You said that most of the crocodiles came into the collection as a whole, but are there any proofs that a part of the crocodiles was turned into like objects, like from naturalia into artificialia, like for example the narwhal to tusked or anything like this? Is there any like part of the crocodile that was turned by goldsmiths or any other artist into like an object?
Right, yeah, right, unlike the narwhal horn, which is a famous story, that starts in the world of medieval trading crusades, very interesting point of view. No, I don't think so. I mean, other than to say, the idea of giving you the crocodile skeleton, which is unusual. I don't know of any depictions of a crocodile skeleton before this one that is in the Royal Society repository in their 1681 catalog that Nehemiah Grew does. And, so there's an instance where, but you haven't transformed it into something else, you're just peeling back, now you're peeling back, the layers of the object itself to give an even deeper, more observational natural history by the standard of, this new, the new experimental observational culture of that period. And I think in a few instances what I have seen, and then you don't know what it is. Like there's another collector, he's a much more obscure collector from the late 16th century, named Antonio Giganti, who traveled in many places, and but ultimately was from Bologna. And a couple of different inventories were made of his little museum he had. He was a secretary to one of the religious figures of this town, and he claimed to have, the skin of a lizard that had been in Camposanto in Pisa. So this is one of these sanctuary ones where instead all you have is the skin. Now, is it a crocodile or is it actually a lizard? We don't know, right? I mean, because it's all confused, we don't know what he really thinks he has. But I took note of it because typically you even though, yes, people do, they have all sorts of animal skins, but it's not, you don't see, that's not a normal description of the way one has it. So, yeah, I don't think that people, I don't think they feel a need to break it up and have it become something else. I think it's actually because of the strength of the, because it's one of the closest things to a dragon, to Leviathan, to the, they actually, there is a need to have it whole. And then there is the physical reality that you can, right? So it's the perfect taxidermic specimen, if we must say so, right? To practice your nascent taxidermy on, you can. In fact, it's a great receptacle, as the Egyptians already knew, right? To preserve other things, as well as to preserve its sacrality. Yeah.
Over here.
The interest over millennia in the crocodile itself makes me wonder about the prevalence of the species, because I feel like it's been around for thousands and thousands of years and it's never become endangered. I mean, even today there are issues in Florida where they're coming out of the woodwork, whereas the rhinoceri have become endangered. So it makes me wonder if the interest in the crocodile reflects the overabundance of the actual species in a natural sense. I don't know if you know anything about that, but I guess I'm just more pondering than questioning.
Yeah, as I've been too. I mean, because as you say, it's not. Right. I mean, so I think we've established they're not hard to find. That's why a play of 1582 can say there are more and more of them showing up because they're not hard to find, and they become even easier. And there becomes even more of a kind of almost banal desire to have them. But then what's not banal is the weight of interpretation, right? The weight of interpretation is quite rich and heavy. And so that it's sort of the perfect situation for an object, as you even say, to become canonical. That it's not so hard to get. You don't have to make it up like a basilisk, or a dragon that you describe and present as a dragon. You can just have it, and then you can interpret it and decide, depending on how you hang it, which interpretation you might want to emphasize, and how the description might also perhaps combine some of these things, or move in a different direction, but never really give up a number of meanings. But yeah, so in a way we can say this is a great case study of how an object that is literally everywhere, right? In fact, one of the details that this young colleague found in one of the 18th century natural histories is this lovely kind of geoclimatic explanation that's kind of characteristic of the 18th century naturalists, that where they decide that the reason they're in the Carolinas is they're all at the same latitude, right? this is the new image, right? That it's a crocodile is kind of an image, it's an 18th century image of circumnavigating the globe, right? If we just hit the right line, there's a kind of like, almost like a crocodile meridian. We can work our way along and, we'll be there. It's like a portalog, to take you around the world. Isn't that wonderful? Yeah, but that's the point. You can always, everywhere you go, there's going to be a crocodile.
There's no decrease in supply.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. That's very helpful about, because this is part of what of course, this whole project started years ago because of the Imperato image. I was just completely fascinated with the way he had, the engraver of this, the anonymous engraver, had emphasized the object that was nowhere in the text, but on the front of this
Can
book.
we come back to that, actually? That's one question, Deborah.
Yeah, this is just related to this. I wonder if there are people who are historians of fashion here who know when people started wearing alligator skin bags and shoes, because that is the question of the part and the whole.
Yeah.
I just literally, I don't know how far back you can trace that.
I would love to know that question. I was thinking of that when we were talking, a question or two earlier, because one imagines it's old, but I don't. Yeah, if there's anyone who ends up either now or afterwards having an answer. Like people in Marseille, just wear them, or right? You would think, like in all the kind of frou-frou fashions of the medieval, especially Renaissance courts, eventually you would start wearing this.
Or even tribal masks.
Yes, exactly. To go to exactly. Now that's a different issue that we would need an anthropologist to
Well, there are those the martins that are biting their own skin that people wear in the Renaissance, like what's her name, the Leonardo lady in Krakow and things like that. So.
All right. Well, you've got me thinking. I need to put this question to my friends who do Renaissance fashion history and see if any of them have an answer. Thanks, Deborah. That's a great. There must be an answer to this, right? It would be nice to know. When do you wear the crocodile?
In Bridges of Sweden. Sorry. Question.
Does she wear a croc?
No, unicorn slippers.
I bless them.
As an icon of Egypt, and it seems like around the same time that there's also a kind of campaign, especially under Sixtus V, to re-erect a lot of the old Egyptian obelisks and readapt them to a Christian situation in front of churches especially. And so I'm just wondering, with the crocodiles hanging from the churches and being used so prevalently, do you see any connection between this kind of, the obelisk as an icon of Egypt and the use of the crocodile and the interest in just kind of reusing the obelisk in an architectural sense, but also a a reinterpreting of theology?
That's a great question. I think that the crocodile, which again goes back to articulating further the many stages of its theological meaning. I think there is a Catholic Reformation crocodile, right? And it is, the conquest of Egypt, of course, is a great symbol for the conquest of, the global Catholicism, right? Has not only conquered this country of Christianity, but it is the Christianity that is everywhere in the world in an age of Catholic missions. And so that, so part of the story, right, of the restoration of Egypt and Rome that begins especially under Sixtus in the late 16th century, is understood in these ways, that how do you represent the power of faith, right, in an age of different versions of how do you represent your, that you are the original and therefore the authentic, version of that. Well, one is you turn to history, of course you're not alone in doing that, so then one debates history. And this issue of the obelisk becomes part of it. Now, in the case of Sixtus, in case of what's going on in the 1590s in Rome, when those first obelisks, the moving of the obelisk, this great engineering project, and, when the obelisk, this restoration of the obelisk in Rome, really gets underway, I would have to look back at some of the literature on Sixtus that I'm not, intimately familiar with, but I don't immediately see crocodiles kind of entering that discussion. But instead, in the world of mid-17th century Rome, in the world of Kircher and Bernini, the crocodile is there, right? with the objects, below the object, near the object, right? I mean, we have to move in a way between the Roman College and Piazza Navona, you know, and to think about these, you know, and you know, on the Nile River God. So there are a lot of ways, I think, that becomes sort of the height of this post-Reformation interpretation of these kinds of things. And at the same time, you have people like the Archbishop of Bologna, a contemporary, older contemporary, right, of Sixtus, who instead would like to remove crocodiles, narwhal horns, ostrich ages from churches, because he no longer thinks that's where they ought to be. They are too pagan, right? He in many ways is countering that older image and trying to separate. This is a bit too profane. You know, which is, I wish he'd written that chapter, needless to say, because I'm filling it in for him about why he wants to talk about these things that are suited for churches, ostensibly with the goal of perhaps removing some, not all. So I still don't really know what he wanted to do with the crocodile in the church, and I'm always a little cautious before I interpret him too far, you know. But I'm trying to think about that. So but I think it is telling, right, in that age that leads up to Sixtus, where, you know, we begin to talk about these things.
You had discussed in how these crocodiles were hung in church settings. It seems very specific, face down, predatory stance. But then in the Imparato image, the crocodile is flipped, and I was wondering if that change in context and that change in display had a sort of deeper meaning, and if anyone contemporary had articulated anything about it.
Yeah. Well, so one of the things I've been figuring out as I kind of go along with this meandering project is that, well, the preferred way of putting the crocodile in the church is hanging upside down off of a chain. It's certainly not the only way, as you see in that photograph from Orient where it's on the wall, which is not the preferred way. And there may have been some examples of them where they're kind of curling, you know, they're kind of situated, arranged a little bit differently, but we only have this sparse, you know, surviving evidence of, you know, 2 to 3 dozen, or, you know, maybe by the time all the Research General discovered there are about 3 dozen right now. We're not there yet. There's, you know, about 28, 29, you know, when I add some that are not in Spencer's, you know, appendix that he started developing, you know, I can think of a few more. So what, you know, and herein lies the problem, to go back to your comment about the absence of the text that goes with that, right? We have just the image. We don't know what the relationship is between the image and the actual museum, right? We don't have an inventory of that museum from this period, as I do with some others, where I can kind of compare that as another way of what's in the cabinet, where it is, how it's described. Because people usually do, in an inventory for economic and inheritance reasons, place things, right? It's very, very useful, you know, for doing that kind of work. And so we don't know that. We don't have a description that tells you more, as we do, say, with Kierkegaard or a number of these other catalogs I've referred to. So we're left with you know, the classic material my colleagues in art history, a number of whom are here, you know, work with, which is the image itself. What's going on there? Why have you flipped it? One, you could say it could be. I mean, we could ask ourselves, are there practical reasons? Is it easier to hang that way? No, not necessarily. Of course not. It depends on its size, though, right? Because, you know, if it's really big, you need, as they certainly want you to think this one is, you would need a very strong chain, right, to hang it the other way. Perhaps the ceilings would go. I mean, again, we don't know how high the ceilings are. I'm offering up sort of practical speculations about reasons, but then one can go back to what I suspect most of us want to do, which is to say, no, it's a choice. That's all fine, but that's not really it. It's a choice, right? It's a choice. Much like the discussion in certain medieval bestiaries in which they depict the crocodile's head upside down to reverse the jaw, it seems, primarily, right? To sort of deal with this discussion of the immobile lower jaw, you know, but they only reverse the head, not the entire body in those images, though I need to still expand my looking through the whole incredible bestiary tradition of the crocodile. So then, in the end, I think that crocodile is, from the perspective not of the reality, but of the image, is flipped over, you know, to help to create a kind of viewpoint, right? Because, well, maybe we'll go back to it and let's see what other people think if I get myself all the way back to that image where I've got it big. excuse everybody who watches this as video because flipping through objects fast is bad. Okay, there we go. So you see the guys pointing up, and it creates, I think it does create, a kind of view line, right? That is bisecting, the center. And what you can't, and also the guy who's pointing, right? So in other words, who has a pointer who's been pointing to things. So I think it is trying to do something that unifies, as I talked about at the beginning of this talk, this object with the people. And that they are connected, that they the relationship between the two of them traverses the space of this. That there is a connection with this object that has not been made with other objects. Not with the stuffed birds, not with the books of pressed plants and images and text, not with the minerals that are overwhelmingly the content. This is Imparato is as a pharmacist, very, very interested in mineralogy. He's very interested in the properties of mineral and other inanimate substances, so he spends a lot of time on that. There's a lot of alchemy, an alchemical or spagyric related text in this. So he, again, is not primarily concerned with animals in his actual natural history. Very big, weighty book that accompanies this. That he may not be the principal author of either. That's a whole other story about the book that's debated even by contemporaries. How much of it was his versus part of a whole research keep at Naples. But if other people have suggestions about how to read this image, I would love to hear them. It's a great image. It deserves many different interpretations.
We'll have to hear them in the informal part. Before we end, couldn't resist while listening to hunt for my own images and online. And it's fascinating the way in which Napoleon's conquest of Egypt is often seen as the beginning of Orientalism, Oriental studies, even though there was so much interest in the Orient before. And Napoleon actually, apparently, struck a commemorative medal based on the Roman model for the conquest of Egypt with a crocodile.
Fantastic.
So, there we go. It's been a wonderful trip through a fantastic landscape. There's a lot more to talk about. We can join Paula outside. For those of you interested in coming back and in noting the coincidental, mystical enjambment of talks, I can't but resist noting that the next talk in this room has as its title, The Elephant in the Room. It's a talk about 19th century porcelain, but for the title alone, it's worth mentioning here today. Paula, thank you very much.